It had been about 10 years since Touhou's inception on the PC-98, and after making Windows its new home, it now looked, played, and sounded better than ever. Like I mentioned in the previous video, those games would set the base for the rest of the series. It wouldn't be wrong to call it the most influential period in Touhou's history, with the additional spell cards, the increased focus on world building, implementing elements from different mythos, the music, and the small quality of life improvements the games received. Imperishable Night acted as a culmination of Sun's ideas for that time, and the scope of that game really made it seem like it would be the last. But then, with Phantasmagoria Flower View coming along, there was obviously intention of keeping the series moving forward, though that game was merely a testing ground for new ideas and concepts, just a preparation for the next real step forward. I personally didn't spend much time with that game at first since, well, it does have a completely different gameplay style that seems more aimed towards multiplayer, with the single player campaign looking more like a bonus. So not long after, I jump over to the next title, which happens to be the 10th entry in the series, or the 10th mainland one at least, since spin-offs are now a thing. Like Embodiment of Scarlet Devil, this is also a bit of a landmark title, bringing along a few changes that would shape the series into something a bit different. Touhou Fujinroku Maran of Faith saw its release on August 17, 2007, and it really feels like the beginning of a new era, in more than one way. Just from navigating the menus, things already seem a lot less rough than the previous titles, and once you get into the game itself, that feeling gets even more obvious, with a much more smoother movement and cleaner graphics. There's also the fact that the game engine itself went through some modifications. We don't really know the details since Sun keeps things closed source, but it's obvious just from looking at the game that plenty of changes were made. So let's talk about that, shall we? I can't really call this a soft reboot again because it's not. We're following the same canon that started with the OSD here, but it is kind of a clean slate after the climax of Imperishable Night and the side trip that was BOFB. And this is already apparent in the character selection, going back to the classic duo of Reimu and Marisa as the only playable options. They each have 3 shot types this time, and most of these are way more gimmicky than the ones we've previously seen. I personally find them to be a tad too specialized. It's not impossible to play around them, but they do require you to change the way you approach the game. That said, you still have the more straightforward options in Reimu A and Marisa B, with the latter having probably the most well-known bug in the games. When power is anywhere between 3 and 3.95, one of the unfocused lasers does 10 times more damage than intended, which, as you can imagine, just melts through everything. And as we'll see in a bit, it's very easy to keep that power level throughout the whole game, so you can do it if you want an easy win, albeit an empty one. But anyways, let's get the most notable gameplay change out of the way, the point of collection. It was introduced with the OSD, but previously you could only make use of it to get items if you were at full power, with the exception being the extra stages for Perfect Cherry Blossom and Imperishable Night, which I completely forgot to mention in the last video. But yeah, in those it was always available regardless of your power level. Well, that is universal now, both in the extra stages and the main game, finally establishing it as a mechanic that would always be present in every game from now on, and something that you gotta keep in mind if you wanna make the most out of the games. The other big change is in the way bombs work. Instead of activating a spell card unique to the character you're playing, both Reimu and Marisa get the same bomb, shooting a circle that damages enemies and erases bullets within it. And instead of using dedicated bomb items, these drop from your power now, 1 full point for 1 bomb. While this makes it very easy to spam bombs during stages since you get your power back really fast, it can be absolutely crippling during boss fights where power is more scarce. Thankfully, it wasn't a permanent change and things would go back to normal eventually, but for this and the next game, this is the way bombs work. I should probably explain the whole power thing too. In previous games it went from 0 to 128, now it only goes up to 5, counting the decimals in between. Every significant power-up happens every whole number, which as mentioned is the cost of a bomb here, so again, there's a greater risk to using bombs in situations where getting power back is not as easy. Well, that's basically the changes to the core gameplay, which you can tell is still getting a bit refined, but it won't be long until we'll finally settle on something consistent. Again, it's in a very similar place as Embodiment of Scarlet Devil, and in fact this game even makes a few callbacks to it, which I find really neat. In Stage 3 there's a section very similar to one from USD's Stage 4, and the final boss has an attack reminiscent of one of Emilia's. But anyways, unlike EOSD though, and like every Touhou game now, Maran of Faith also has a gimmick unique to it, the Faith system. Remember the Dream system from PC-98? Yeah, we're doing that again. Defeating enemies and collecting green items increases your Faith counter at the bottom left corner, which in turn makes everything else award more points. It's probably the most consistent iteration of it so far, but again, not something that affects casual gameplay that much. Oh, we'll get to the more intrusive gimmicks very soon. I do wanna go on a tangent about the music real quick because it also has changed quite a bit. Sun had already been using instruments besides the SD90 all the way back on PCB, but I think it's here where those new sounds become way more prominent. The piano coupled with the drums are basically the defining feature of the music for this era, and really gives the soundtrack that sort of off-road, countryside feeling to it, which complements the atmosphere of the games really well. Last video I mentioned that every game does have a unique sound to it, and while that's gonna remain true, I feel like the music from this era remains just a little bit more consistent than usual, which is another way of binding these games together. While the gameplay already puts this game quite far apart from previous entries, that's not really the main reason I consider Modern Era of Faith a new beginning. I think the biggest change here is the approach to the writing and world building. Sun is still writing character profiles, mind you, and reading those is still the best way to learn about them, but now the way dialogue is handled in-game is a lot more concrete and focused. I think I said the same thing for Perfect Cherry Blossom actually, and the rest of the early Windows games, but this is kinda like another upgrade to that. It's like a part 2 of this new writing style. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. For the most part, the dialogue is now more aimed at guiding you both through the plot of the game and the world it takes place in, along with it doing a way better job at communicating the characters' personalities. It's not as obvious right now since this is the first game to start taking that approach, but it becomes way more apparent as you go forward. Speaking of new characters, from now on most of them would still retain some presence in the series, especially when it comes to the most relevant ones like the Moria Shrine Girls in this game, but it also applies to the others that just got caught up in this mess, like Nitori Kawashiro and Ayasha Meimeru. And with the introduction of Yokai Maran as the main setting in this game, not only does every single character have a place to live now instead of just being around there, but Gensokyo as a whole stops feeling like just a bunch of isolated landmarks and more like a geographical location that you can actually map out. I know part of this is just a natural result of, more and more things being added, but it's undeniable that there's way more thought put into everything now when compared to the early Windows games. Also, if you wanted to go this route, you could say all this innovation is reflected in the characters themselves. You got Kappa that create different pieces of technology, Tengo journalists in charge of writing and delivering newspaper, and of course they got Kanako Yasaka coming over from the outside world and bringing with her a bunch of contemporary ideas to Gensokyo. That's going to become a very important aspect of Touhou actually, mixing elements from the outside world, which here means our real world, with the fantasy setting of the series. Usually accompanying that is the idea that things that are forgotten in our world end up in Gensokyo, which is why it's inhabited by yokai, fairies, gods, and such. If we wanna be accurate, this whole thing actually started way back outside of the games. In Curiosities of Lotus Asia, the characters find an old computer and even a Game Boy at one point, if you can believe it. And this is a bit different, but when the hell am I gonna talk about it? Sun's music CD series, commonly known as the Hifu series, aside from having more experimental music than what's found in the games, tells stories about two girls living in a somewhat futuristic version of our world, as they have close encounters with the world of Gensokyo. But anyways, I'm getting off track. This is one of the defining aspects of Touhou, and these contemporary elements will show up a lot in the future. Usually in very subtle ways, although the next game we'll talk about is definitely not subtle about it. Alright, so all this, I believe, comes at the cost of kinda starting to lose that aura of wonder and mystery that Touhou had up until now. You know, as things become more defined, there's obviously gonna be less blanks to fill. Still plenty of those, mind you. Touhou has always remained a very open-ended series where you can pretty much make anything work. The only difference is that now it's building up its own identity. While I do greatly enjoy that feeling the earlier games went for, I do also like this new approach. I think it was a step in the right direction all things considered. And what this allowed for is that for the first time we have a game that ties in directly to the next one. Modern Era of Faith is also the beginning of the Religious Wars arc, which is kinda gonna be slow cooking in the bag until all the relevant characters have been introduced, so we'll come back to that later. For now, let's just continue on with the next game, which has recently become one of my personal favorites. Touhou Chireiden Subterranean Animism is the 11th entry in the series, released August 16, 2008. While the previous game had us going up a mountain, now we're going down a reverse mountain. Underground, that is. Apparently inspired by a cave Sun went to. This area is also a lot about expanding the scope of Gensokyo, and now we get to see a completely different facet of it. In the underground, we find a somewhat different set of yokai, with abilities that make them more dangerous than usual, like Yamame Kurodani who can manipulate the seas, or just not very good conversation partners, like Satoriko Meiji with her ability to read minds. She's very smug about it too. You might be wondering how this game follows up from Modern Era of Faith, so let's talk about that real quick. So the story in Subterranean Animism is that a geyser starts erupting, which is all well and good at first, until Spirit spirits start coming out of it. So our heroine goes to the underground to investigate this incident, eventually finding out that it was Rinka and Byo who sent the spirits, in an attempt to get the attention of someone strong who could stop Utsuho Ryuji, gone mad with the power she got from Kanako, that being the three-legged crow Yatagarasu. To avoid going into detail, the Yatagarasu is often associated with the sun, thus giving Utsuho that very same power, the power of nuclear fusion. This is all because Kanako wanted to secure a source of energy for her future plans, but that is not what these videos are about, so that is something we're not gonna go into. So yeah, that's how this game ties into the previous one. I'm getting a bit ahead here, but this detail about Kanako is only mentioned in 4 out of the 6 routes this game has, which is pretty good, but it also means that if you happen to play the 2 that don't include it, this is something you never know about unless you read it up. Touhou games do this a lot, where certain information is only available with some characters, and that ranges from random fun trivia to, you know, bombshells like Kanako was behind all of this. It's another way to encourage replaying the games with different characters, I guess, but I'm still not sure how to feel about the very important details only being available to some. Kinda makes the routes that don't have them less relevant by comparison, like I went through it for nothing since the big reveal happened somewhere else. It'd be a different story if all the characters got a bit of info each, so you know, it'd be like every time you beat the game, you get another piece of the puzzle as you slowly start to see the big picture, but that doesn't really happen in any Touhou game. Anyways, overall, I don't think this is an issue, but, you know, just keep in mind that one playthrough may not give you all the details about the plot. Okay, let's talk gameplay. Once again, only Reimu and Meris are playable, each having 3 shot types, but this time those options are based on a second partner, Reimu getting Yukari, Aya or Suika, who I haven't named so far because she debuted in a spin-off game, while Marisa gets Alice, Patchouli or Nitori. It's kind of a callback to Imperishable Night, the only difference is that the partner isn't physically there, but they can still communicate and do interact with everyone else found on the way. I've already talked about how much I like the system in Imperishable Night since it makes for more lively dialogue, and it's the same deal here. Kinda makes me wish it was a thing in more games, but sadly, this is the last time we'll see something like it. Anyways, the shot types themselves. Like Modern Era of Touhou, most of these are very specialized and have some sort of quirk to them, like Yukari allowing Reimu to warp through the edges of the screen, or Patchouli giving Marisa 5 different shots that you can cycle through depending on the situation. Also, we go back to everyone having different bombs, but they're still not the spell cards we've seen in previous games. I find the shots way more interesting and fun to try out than what Modern Era of Touhou offered, however again, they do require you to adapt your playstyle accordingly. All that said, Reimu and Yukari just outclass all of them most of the time, since they deal the most consistent damage and you don't have to do anything weird for it. But one more thing about the shot types though is that they change the way the stage 4 boss plays out. Satori will use spell cards from whatever partner you brought along, which is just a great way to integrate a character's abilities into the gameplay, and a nice throwback to those boss fights. Except for Suika, since she never showed up as a boss in a main game. They are adapted a little bit to better match a stage 4 boss, especially with Yukari, but in any case, it's just something that I find really neat. I'm gonna get the gimmick out of the way because it's very simple. When you graze, this little gauge at the corner goes up and makes items worth more points, and once it fills up, you auto-collect every item on screen, like when you get to the point of collection. That's it, that's all it does. Alright, let's move on to something more interesting. If you've ever seen talk about the difficulty of the games, this one usually sits somewhere at the top as one of the hardest. So how true is that? Well, yeah, it is pretty hard compared to the previous games. And I knew that all the way back when I played it for the first time. It had that sort of reputation that gave it an intimidating and menacing aura, but that just made the idea of beating it that much more enticing. That said, it took me about 10 years until I finally won CC this game. In fact, one of my first uploads to this channel before I started making actual videos is one of my first clears of the extra boss. But let's get to the point already. What makes this game difficult? Well, most of it is obviously that the patterns are tricky and take some practice to consistently get through. Spamming bombs is also not a reliable option like in the last game, since they're not as powerful to begin with and it now takes more items to get your power back. But I think another reason is that while this game greatly rewards you for doing well, it also heavily punishes you for doing bad. This is the first game to introduce life pieces as the way to get extra lives, and it'll be the way to get extra lives in every following game. What varies is the way you get those pieces and how many you need. Here it's 5 pieces to get 1 extra life, and you get 1 life piece when you get through any boss attack without dying. You still get it if you use bombs, you just can't die during it. It's a good way to incentivize getting good, if you will, especially for the earlier stages, since you can amass a good stock of extra lives for the harder stages later on. But it also means that if you're eating shit, the game will not give you any breaks. Dying to a boss means you're not getting a life piece, which puts that next extra life you need even further away. So yeah, I can see why people are a bit turned off by this. I mean, I already told you my initial experience with it. But once I finally decided to really put my mind to it and grind it for the 1cc, I found this game to be one of the most fun ones to play, honestly. I think it really has some of the most interesting spell cards you will find in the series, especially when it comes to the extra boss Koishi Komiji. Yeah, she's a very popular character outside of this game, you've probably seen her around, but her boss fight I think is one of the best. It has some very creative spell cards that fit the character really well, and it might have had some influence in why she resonated so well in the community. You know, aside from her backstory, that's also a big reason. Honestly, I'm a big sucker for anything surrounding the Chiriden crew, those being Rin, Utsuho and the Komagis. While we do learn plenty about them from the game and their profiles, there's still a lot open to interpretation, and as with most things in Touhou, it's really interesting to explore all the different possibilities with them. So anyways, in conclusion, Subterranean Animism was a good way to follow up on what Modern Era of Faith brought, and I think it's just a solid title all around. The game itself does have a bit more of a learning curve compared to the others, but like I said, it's really worth it getting through that curve, and I really urge you to try it out if you're up to the challenge. It's also got a fantastic atmosphere. The backgrounds and music really makes it feel like a journey to an unknown region, one that you'd expect to be deserted, but no, things are actually pretty lively down here. From the former capital where the Oni live, to the Palace of Earth Spirits with Satori and her pets. This whole underground might as well be its own world within Kensokyo. And while the characters wouldn't remain as present in the series compared to the previous game's cast, mostly because, you know, they live underground, we don't really go back there often, they do play an important role in this world, although we don't really see the ramifications of that in the main games. But anyways, while we were busy trying to stop the nuclear bear from going berserk, some other pieces were beginning to move, and they would soon bring about another incident. So after taking a look at the depths of Kensokyo, it is now time to head back out into the skies. Touhou Seidensen Undefined Fantastic Object, the 12th game in the series released August 15th, 2009. Yes, the English name is a play on Unidentified Flying Object, alright, let's go. So while the previous two games immediately hit you with some novelties straight from the premise, now we're starting to get a bit more settled. That's not to say there's nothing noteworthy in this game, we'll get to that, but change now starts getting a bit more subtle. We're not taking big leaps from game to game anymore, now it's about the smaller steps, little things here and there. But before any of that, again this does follow up from the last game, and again we can point to Kanako as the source of everything. So the Geysers erupting had the side effect of breaking the seal on a group of yokai who basically make up the entire cast of this game, making it the only time every new character introduced is part of the same group, by the way. Along with the ship, yes, a flying ship just shot out from underground, don't worry about it. Anyways, these yokai all follow the teachings of Byakuren Hichiri, a Buddhist nun who had been sealed away for helping out yokai instead of exterminating them. Where was she sealed? Well, in Hokkai, of course. What is Hokkai? It's a region of Makai. That's right, we're actually going back to Makai after what seems like an eternity. To go even further, one of Byakuren's spell cards, Devil's Recitation, looks a lot like one of the attacks Shinki uses in Mystic Square. And well, this is gonna be the last time we'll see anything PC-98 in the newer games, unless the upcoming game decides to blow everyone's minds. But anyways, back to UFO. The plot of this game is all these yokai trying, and eventually succeeding in bringing back Byakuren, finally settling down at the Byorin Temple, on top of a certain place which is gonna be relevant in the next game. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's basically the gist of it. Again, the highlight of this is all these characters being part of the same faction, the Buddhists. I think you can start to see why this is called the religious wars, but we're still missing one ingredient to really bring everything together, so for now let's just move on to the gameplay changes. We got the usual Reimu and Marisa, along with Sanae, making her debut as a playable character, who would start the trend of almost every new playable character having been a stage 5 boss in their original game. We're pretty much done with the gimmicky shot taps in this game though, with everyone basically playing in the same way, which I think makes things a lot more consistent, and allows you to choose whatever character you want without worrying about having to play 4D chess because of their shot. Anyways, the biggest change though is that we go back to having bomb items, and to those activating a spell card unique to each character and shop type combo. I honestly think this just works much better than having bombs draw from the power meter, so I was glad to see that return. We now also have bomb pieces in the same way life pieces were a thing in the previous game, and to explain how to get those, we have to talk about the gimmick of this game, and boy it is a doozy. Alright, here we go. While going through the stages, certain enemies will drop these UFOs that bounce around the screen, which can be red, green or blue. Some of them have a static color, others will cycle through them every few seconds. Getting 3 of the same will spawn an UFO mini-boss of that color. When defeated, red ones will give you life pieces, and this is the only reliable way to get life pieces. Green is the same but for bomb pieces, and blue UFOs just give you points. These guys will also slowly absorb every item on screen, filling up a circle around them. Once that is full, they will drop additional resources, so it's very important to wait for that moment before dealing with them. You can also get a flashing UFO if you collect one of each, but all it does is convert power items into point items and vice versa. For casual gameplay, the most important one really is the red UFO, and to a lesser degree, the green UFO. It's kinda the same deal as Subterranean Animism. If you can play around this and get all the UFOs without losing much in the process, great! The game is extremely generous with these resources. You can pretty much max out your your life counter by stage 4. If you can't play around it however, well, tough shit. Also like Subterranean Animism, this game also has a lot of sections that are tricky to get through, so having that cushion of extra lives is extremely helpful. However, while in that game the only requirement to get more lives was to do well, here you gotta go out of your way to collect these UFOs and fight a tanky enemy to get life pieces, which is made harder by the fact that, as mentioned, they bounce around the screen, so you really gotta weave in between those bullets if you wanna pick them up. And they switch colors. You have no idea how many times I ended up getting a new UFO I didn't want just because it switched right as I was about to get it. So yeah, in conclusion, until you can get used to it, this is a very unforgiving mechanic to play around. It's really not as bad as I'm making it out to be though, but it's still something you have to constantly keep in mind if you want a chance at beating the game. Or you know, just don't get hit, lol. Anyways, I don't think I got much else to say about Undefined Fantastic Object. It's a solid game like its predecessors, but aside from the gimmick, it doesn't really have much that makes it stand out in my opinion. The cast of characters I remember not caring much about initially, but they've really grown on me over the years. It's the biggest faction we've had in Touhou and, again, it's really interesting to see and think about the dynamics between its members. It just sort of ends up feeling like a big family. But yeah, even when I played it for the first time, this is a game that didn't particularly have any impact on me, and that is a sentiment I keep to this day. That is obviously entirely subjective, I realize that. I will say that the soundtrack is pretty damn good though, especially on the latter half of the game. But I mean, Touhou music is rarely underwhelming, right? Getting to stage 6 and hearing Fires of Hawkeye for the first time is just... chills, man. Also, I only found out recently that UFO has a similar reputation as other games because of its difficulty. Honestly, despite what I said earlier, I never had much trouble going back to this game, and in fact, I remember beating it during my first attempts at it. It is a much harder game compared to Modern Era of Touhou, sure, the gimmick is hard to get around, and there are some really evil spell cards thrown around stages 4 and 5, but I still think Subterranean Animism wins out in the overall difficulty department. Leaving all that aside, like I mentioned, the plot of UFO is also a result of Kaneko's actions, like in the last game, but the connection is a bit less direct and, you know, it ends up feeling more like a standalone game to me. Which is fine, I mean, that's how Touhou's been doing things up until Modern Era of Touhou, but seeing as it's supposed to be a bit of a follow-up to Subterranean Animism, I don't know, it feels a bit disjointed. It is, however, the direct cause for the next game to happen, but we're gonna talk about that one next time. Yeah, I thought about the possibility of adding that game to this video, but while it does have some connection to the games we talked about, and leads into the final act of this religious war saga, I think overall it doesn't really fit in with the rest. So this is gonna be how I view the Modern Era of Touhou, neatly tying it as another trilogy like the early Windows games. Well, kinda anyways. To summarize, I think Sun accomplished 3 things with these games. Expanding the scope of Gensokyo to make this world into something more concrete, while also solidifying Touhou's identity, expanding upon the characters, giving them better defined personalities and roles to carry out in this new world, and refining the gameplay, both in the general sense and by adding new mechanics, though this last one still needs a bit of work. Either way, we saw the series go through quite a bit of change in this era, with everything that was introduced in the previous games being improved tenfold. Touhou actually hit its peak of popularity around this point. In fact, I've seen some people refer to this and the previous games as the golden days of the series, which I'm aware it's influenced by other factors outside of it, but you know, it really was a pretty big deal. So where do we go from now? We saw the beginnings of Touhou Project, the introduction of new ideas, and now with the modern era, we saw how those evolved and continued to change the series. Well, overall, this growth will continue with every new installment, but like I mentioned earlier, after Undefined Fantastic Object, things would start to get a bit more calm and unclear. A time of transition, and what I would consider to be the final act for everything we've seen about Touhou so far, before moving on to the next big era. Stay tuned for that. For now, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing, leave a comment about that one thing I obviously missed, and consider stopping by my streams on Twitch. We have fun there, I promise. With that, see you next stream.